There are more than 22 million working age people with disabilities, and today only 1 in 3 has a job. We will now learn from the top experts in the public and private sectors who are enabling employers to thrive by bringing in the talents of people with disabilities, and learn what more can be done. So to kick off this panel, I'm turning over the Zoom to RespectAbility's Policy and Practices Director, Philip Kahn-Pauli. Philip will introduce our panelists and we'll get this conversation started. So Philip, you're on.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much to our panelists. One last quick housekeeping item. I will just say that because I will say that one of the most important lessons I've learned from living and working in the era of COVID on disability employment issues is the importance of patience and flexibility. And I will need to ask our audience's patience and flexibility today because we are short 2 panelists. We are short Tina Williams from OFCCP, and later we are short Janet Lebrecht, RespectAbility board member and thought leader on vocational rehabilitation services. They are both been called away by other responsibilities, and we wish they were here, but we will do our best to talk through everything that they would have covered. To quickly introduce our panelists, I'm going to start with Director Craig Leen of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, OFCCP. This office is critically important for the world of disability employment because it is specifically around issues related to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And OFCCP has really been a thought leader in helping drive through compliance federal contractors to become more inclusive of people with disabilities in their talent pipeline. He is a scholar, he's a thought leader, he is a teacher, and he has been working hard to make Section 503 work for as many federal contractors and workers with disabilities as possible. Also joining him from within the executive branch of government is Mark Schultz from the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services at the Department of Education. He is also the commissioner, he's the acting assistant secretary and commissioner of the Rehabilitation Services Administration, which oversees billions of dollars in funding to get people with disabilities to work. I will also shout out, this is not the only anniversary we are celebrating today. Beyond the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, this year is also the 100th anniversary of the Rehabilitation Services Administration, going back to the legacy of World War I. So he is the Senior Service of Disability Employment and has previously served as the leader of vocational rehabilitation in the state of Nebraska. And there, I'm pleased to say that Nebraska has consistently had one of the highest employment rates of people with disabilities of any state in the country, and he now brings that leadership at the federal level. Rounding out our panel today is Shane Kanady, Vice President of Workforce Development at SourceAmerica. He is a thought leader and a really hard worker in the world of economic and social inclusion for people with disabilities. He has been with SourceAmerica for many years, has risen through the ranks, is very involved with issues related to the Convention on the Rights of People with Rights of Persons with Disabilities. He's also a published author with several very thoughtful pieces on the future of work, and has been wrapping up some additional studies at George Mason University. So Shane, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to go, I mentioned the anniversary of the Rehabilitation Services as well as the ADA, and I bring that up because both 1920 and 1990 are very different years from 2020. And so, Mark, I'd like to call on you first. Given the very different world of work and the very present reality of this pandemic, I'm curious, what do you see as some of the successes, some of the positive stories or positive work that you've been done to get more people with disabilities into the workforce even nowadays?
I think obviously, and first of all, I want to thank you, Phil, for mentioning the anniversary. So those of you that have heard me speak in the past, I think it would be no surprise that I was intending to bring that up as well. That we are celebrating the 100th anniversary, and that we actually have a very deep connection with the ADA, as you know, because Section 504, the Rehab Act, contained in the Rehab Act of 1973, really was one of the first civil rights laws addressing the protections for individuals with disabilities from discrimination. It was essentially the foundation for the ADA. So we have a close connection, and I'm glad to be a part of the celebration today. So some of the successes, I think, in terms over the years, the VR programs have really had to respond to the changes of the environment and the things that were happening around us. So we've had to innovate and create, be creative over the years. And the COVID-19 pandemic has certainly challenged us. And as we look across the country, we're seeing many of the programs have responded admirably to meeting the needs of individuals through remote service delivery, including telework for their own staff and employees. So they've had to innovate. And at the same time, we've also seen a lot of opportunities with employers. And, you know, that varies based on the career fields, obviously, but there are opportunities out there, and our programs continue to reach out to employers and continue to make matches with qualified individuals.
Wonderful, thank you. Shane, I want to go to you next and ask you that same question. You know, it's a very different year we are in now, but where are you seeing successes, or where do you think that we can be as a field more successful in getting people with disabilities into work, even with the current economic conditions?
Thank you, Philip. So a couple of examples that I've seen recently and have been fortunate enough to be involved with a recent symposium by XR Access, XR standing for extended reality. And from a macro level, it's bringing together users, developers, investors, and policymakers around emerging technologies. And how do you leverage extended reality as a means for opening up the labor force participation, especially as these trends are accelerating due to the pandemic. I think that's a really exciting opportunity. It's really a notable bright point of something that's happening. From a micro level, groups like Vanderbilt University's Frisch Center for Autism and Innovation using virtual reality as a means for honing interviewing skills for persons on the autism spectrum, but also for employers on the other side of that. And then there's so many opportunities to then take those examples and find ways to amplify them through organizations like SourceAmerica and other disability community groups. So using virtual reality for experiential learning, using augmented reality for employment and employment supports, looking at things like user experience testing performed by persons with disabilities. All of these emerging technologies need to have an inclusive approach to their design and their function. So who better to do that than persons with disabilities? And this provides a great employment opportunity as well.
Wonderful, thank you, Shane. Craig, we're going to you next. Again, you know, 2020 is a very different year than 1990 or 1973 or 1920. So where are you seeing successes, and what are some of the things that you really want to highlight to the wider world of disability employment?
Certainly, thank you. It's a true pleasure and honor to be here on the week of the 30th anniversary of the ADA. OFCCP has committed this fiscal year to significantly enhancing everything that it's doing to enforce Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act. And we're building on prior administrations, prior directors, prior policies to do so. Many of you know that the agency has been very focused on the 7% employment goal for federal contractors in Section 503. What we are trying to do, though, is expand that to also look at compensation, promotions, opportunities generally of federal contractors to be inclusive in every aspect of the employment process. And we ask those in HR, those who are corporate leaders, to really take to heart the goal that we need to be fully inclusive of people with disabilities in all aspects of employment. And so what we are seeing during the COVID period, and we do have during the pandemic, and we do have a sort of a unique perspective because we're in the midst of doing our Section 503 focused reviews, which is one of our enforcement mechanisms. We've ordered 500 reviews of federal contractor headquarters, some of the biggest companies in the United States, some of the biggest companies in the world, going in and looking at their corporate headquarters, looking at their policies and practices for inclusion. And what we're finding, and I think this is very positive, even amidst the pandemic and even amidst a lot of concern about higher unemployment rates for people with disabilities, we do see companies that are federal contractors taking the lead in adopting inclusive employment practices. As I mentioned, we've been conducting these 503 focus reviews as we speak, we're instead of going on site and physically inspecting premises, we are doing things virtually and by interviews, and also looking at the records of companies to see how they're treating people with disabilities, and doing interviews with corporate leadership. And what we are finding is that companies are adopting the best practices that we've suggested on our website. And for those who don't know about that, I highly suggest that you go on the OFCCP website. You can do a web search, just put OFCCP focused review landing page, or section 503 focused reviews, and you will see a list of approximately 15 best practices from the agency, things like a centralized accommodation system, suggestions for how corporate leadership can give welcoming messages to people with disabilities, suggestions on how to construct disability inclusion programs, disability hiring programs, autism at work programs, suggestions for how to engage with vocational rehabilitation agencies in your state and locality, how to engage with OFCCP so that we can provide you compliance assistance so that you can go above and beyond the requirements of law in doing outreach to individuals with disabilities. Now, having said all that, I still would say that we have to be keenly aware as well of the statistics in this area, which are getting worse because of COVID. Typically, as you all know, and you referred to about 1/3 of people with disabilities having a job, the labor force participation rate for people with disabilities continues to be lower, far lower than it should. It's about 1 in 5, whereas it's about 3 in 5 for the general population. The unemployment rate for people with disabilities is typically double the general unemployment rate. And as you can guess, as unemployment has been going up because of the pandemic, it's going up more so for people with disabilities. And the wage gap, which I feel does not get mentioned enough, is over 30 cents on the dollar, maybe up to 40 cents on the dollar for people with disabilities. These are things that need to be comprehensively addressed. And it is really advantageous to the American economy to engage with individuals with disabilities. It's an untapped source of significant talent. We know for a fact that between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 people in the United States have disabilities. And we need to be tapping into that resource. And as you mentioned before, there's a great resiliency in individuals with disabilities who, as you can see based on these numbers, have experienced discrimination in their life and in the workforce, and yet continue to succeed. So there is a great benefit for federal contractors to do outreach to individuals with disabilities. Not only is it required by law, and let me repeat, it is. If you're a federal contractor, you need to be doing outreach to people with disabilities. You need to be seeking to get to that 7% utilization goal across your workforce. But it's beyond that. OFCCP is going to be moving into new areas. We're going to be looking at compensation and promotion discrimination, as I mentioned, similar to how we look at race and gender, where we look at OFCCP is well known for doing compensation audits based on race and gender. And we are looking in our focused review program in appropriate circumstances where we see an indicator or a problem area to do it in those focus reviews as well. And we're hoping to incorporate this into our entire program. But you shouldn't just do it because the enforcement agency says so. You should do it because it's the right thing to do. And the main point I want to make is you got to be mindful, not just of the hiring and utilization, but of promotions and opportunities. Because one of the things, I have 2 children who have been diagnosed on the autism spectrum. My daughter has a very profound intellectual disability and is on the autism spectrum. And I have fought for accommodations for her in my personal life for years. And it's one of the reasons I'm in this job and why I feel so passionately about these issues. But one of the things that's often said about, for example, individuals with autism or individuals with disabilities generally is that, well, it's good to hire individuals with disabilities because they stay in the job longer. Well, that's true, actually. The stats show that, but that's not necessarily a good thing for people with disabilities in the long run. Because what often happens is if you're in a job because you've been granted an accommodation and you're happy with your situation, and it's hard to move because of the low labor force participation rate and high unemployment rate, it makes that protected class subject to discrimination or exploitation because companies know that they may not move as easily as others, and it's incumbent on you as the leaders of your agency to be doing reviews of compensation and promotions to make sure you're treating individuals with disabilities the same as others. And hopefully we will have a day, one day, hopefully soon, where individuals with disabilities can move from company to company like anyone else and as easily as anyone else, and that the statistics will show this. And then last, I just want to mention, we're coming up with accommodations focused reviews soon. So not only are we doing the Section 503 focus reviews, we are going to be doing focus reviews on accommodations. And so I just, when you go on our website, look at the centralized accommodation system closely, because we're going to be looking for those. They may not be required by law, but they are definitely a best practice. And it is very possible you will be discriminating against people with disabilities if you don't have one. We're going to be looking at accommodations in the same way we're doing our Section 503 focus reviews. And it's going to be disability accommodations and religious accommodations. But for purposes of this talk today, I'm going to focus on disability accommodations. We're going to be looking at every accommodation that you have denied. And we're going to be looking to make sure that that you're doing the appropriate things in those reviews. And let me tell you my general view. The best companies in this area, the ones that have the highest utilization rates and the disability inclusion programs, they generally grant every accommodation. And they amortize the cost across the company, and they have a centralized accommodation process, and they generally grant them as a matter of course. And you should be working to that goal, because anytime you can grant an accommodation, it increases productivity. And by law, in almost all cases, it's a good thing to do generally. And the way you attract employees who have disabilities or have them self-identify is by having a welcoming environment where they know they can get an accommodation if they need one, and they know that they can have an affinity group or some sort of employee resource group for people with disabilities, and even beyond that for parents with disabilities, for people with different types of disabilities or kinds of disabilities. If you have a large population in your company, having a lot of different policies for people with disabilities is what will attract people with disabilities to your company. And we know also, based on studies, that means your company will do better, because inclusive companies for people with disabilities have greater growth and greater productivity. And these are statistics. This is just not me saying this. So anyhow, that's what we're working on. We're very proud to be doing this, the 30th anniversary of the ADA. Thank you, everybody. Thank you and I know I'm just a panelist, but Phil did say I could speak for a little bit extra to get this out. And I wanted everyone to hear all these things.
Well, we really appreciate it, Craig, and your passion is very clear and very evident, and I think you're making a major difference because of that. I want to go to Mark next and really talk about that question of labor force participation rates and how metrics drive success. Obviously, OFCCP has the 7% goal on federal contracts, but Mark, I'm really curious, how does the vocational rehabilitation system use metrics to track the work that you're doing? How do you measure skill attainment for your clients with disabilities, placement rates, and really how do you leverage, the metrics that you have to follow to really drive people into the workforce?
Absolutely. I think, as you know, we've established some performance measures that we utilize to evaluate that. But also, I think one of the things that I just want to start with is traditionally we've been based, I think, focused on helping individuals with disabilities get a job, and any job. And I really think that we need to be moving towards looking at more quality employment. And by that, I mean employment which is meaningful to the individual, gets them on a career pathway that will then enable them to achieve economic self-sufficiency, to have benefits, higher wages, and so forth. So using some of the metrics to drive that, we're looking at the performance measures around the wages, and second and fourth quarter after exit from the program. Those metrics drive some of that, but I think we're going to have to continue to look at what other metrics might drive those changes as we go forward. I think as we look at some of the metrics around the gaps that exist, trying to move us away from looking at just what a successful outcome and those numbers are, but looking again at those quality kinds of measures that show that we've helped someone achieve meaningful employment. So that starts, I think, with increasing expectations from the very beginning, both for the individual, that VR is going to be there and being able to provide that support, to provide the services that enable them to have those opportunities to be successful in the career path that they choose. So that's a mindset that's going to take some time to put into place. And I think WIOA moves us in that direction and establishes those metrics to do that. But so I would give you an example in some of the things that we're looking at is creating the expectation around the limitations on the use of subminimum wages, for example. So WIOA establishes that and moves us away to competitive integrated employment. And through competitive, meaning that we're paying at least a minimum wage or a wage that would be expected to be paid to any individual in that same position, whether they have a disability or not. So Section 511 of the Rehab Act drives us towards reducing the number of Section 14C certificates, which are those that are authorized to pay a subminimum wage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So in looking at that and trying to track the metrics around that, we had some research that was conducted by our Technical Assistance Center, the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center, or WINTEC, and looking at wage and hour data from last year to this year, from around July 19th to January 20th, or January 2020, we saw an overall decrease of 145 certificate holders and a decrease of 8,681 subminimum wage workers. So I think looking at those metrics, we're starting to see that there's an impact. And we can look at other evidence, I think, that starts to show that we're moving in the right direction. We know at least 4 states have eliminated the option of paying individuals with disabilities a subminimum wage. And we have several others that have passed legislation to start to phase out subminimum wages. So I think it's important that we continue to look at those metrics so that we know that we're having the success that we intend with the policies that we put into place.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. And I wanted to ask Shane, obviously the title of this panel is around the future of work and not just where we are. And I'm really curious, what do you see as being kind of, as we look to what does the future of work look like, and what do you think are the kinds of metrics that companies, nonprofits, federal agencies need to look to? I think we saw a little bit of it with both Craig and Mark talking about, the wage gap and improving skills, but also quality of work measures. So what do future metrics look like, Shane?
Sure. So I think that's certainly an important question, because what gets measured gets done, as goes the saying. But I think the philosophical underpinning of some of those things, that there's a presumption that people are assigning the same level of value to others. Right. And so the general notion that the social identity of persons with disabilities, that companies or that policymakers and those other groups are seeing that persons with disabilities have just as much to contribute to the workforce or in the fields of education or as economic contributors, not just beneficiaries as anybody else. That's important. And to get to that point is where you would actually create some momentum and some movement. So Mr. Schultz referenced an example of a movement in one direction in terms of the 14C utilization, and seeing a decrease year over year in that as a symbol of progress. And it's important that people understand what that means in context and what that relates to in terms of an overall mindset shift in the inclusion of persons with disabilities, and how that relates to the future of economic opportunity. But when we see events like recessions occur, where persons with disabilities over the last 4 recessions during a point of economic recovery, their employment rates have decreased by 9% relative to persons with without disabilities whose employment levels have increased by 2% during those events. What happens when these economic disruptions occur in the midst of these shifts from one policy lever to hopefully more inclusive employment, but then we run up against a recession? And understanding the impact that people experience during that, I'm not sure if there's enough data around that. I don't think that we necessarily think through that when it comes to these sort of unprecedented events. And so understanding even what happened during the last recession, and individuals that might have shifted from off 14C when the recession hit, and then there was a period of recovery. What was their experience? What happened with their employment situation? And did we see a change in the use of something like 14C as people tried to re-enter the labor force? Is that a mechanism that someone might utilize? I don't know. But putting those all in context, right? This all has to do with the overall kind of assignment of value of persons with disabilities in a social situation. So before we can really talk about metrics, like what does success look like, we have to have people understanding that there is the same amount of value that anyone can create as a contributor as their non-disabled peers.
Thank you so much, Jane. And I think that really captures it is, we all, not only are we all in this because we care about nothing about us without us, we all have our connections to disability, both personal and familial. But it is fundamentally about driving home that equal value and the equal opportunity. And I think that we are really starting to push that, and we have obviously some economic headwinds, but we have opportunities even in those difficult times. I do want to kind of quickly ask everyone here very quickly, for Mark, Craig, and Shane, what advice would you give to a current job seeker with a disability? What specifically would you tell them to, what should they do now, or what should they go out and learn or study, or, where should they, get started on their job search? So let's go with Mark first.
Sure. Well, I would tell them first, if they're a student, I would say they need to participate in FBLA, FFA, Educators Rising, any of those career and technical student organizations. It's a great place, great opportunity to start to learn those entrepreneurial skills and to have some experience by participating in activities, events, and competitions. I would also say individuals should take advantage of any work-based learning opportunities, apprenticeships. They should seek credentials, particularly in high demand fields, and really understand the labor market trends and needs in their area. I think unless they're willing to look to move or explore new career opportunities, that's going to be a foundational aspect of trying to decide what your career pathway is going to be. So, and to look at STEM careers, I think there's the high demand there and a high need. But also to be prepared to discuss your disability and how perceived barriers could be overcome so that you're addressing those employers' misconceptions or misperceptions. I think up front would be important. And also, I think to seek out peer mentors, role models in your chosen field that can help support you as you pursue that career path. I think that's real important to success. I know just for me it was. I had a mentor as I started out in the profession that was valuable to me and giving me information that I couldn't pick up any other way. So, and lastly, I would say, don't be afraid to start with a VR office near you. That's why they exist, to provide assistance with the career planning and the services and supports that can help you as you pursue that career.
Craig. Again, that question, what advice would you give to a job seeker with a disability at this moment to, bump up their skills and, prepare to find that new job, even with everything that's going on right now?
I mean, much of the advice would be the same as someone without a disability. In terms of the part that I think would be, if I was going to give them specific advice, it would be one, look at federal contractors. Federal contractors already have the 503 obligation, an affirmative action obligation, and a utilization goal. So look at them, and they should have the best accommodation programs that exist. Two, I tell them to go to the OFCCP website and look at the different companies' disability inclusion programs that we already have up there. If they have autism, I'd say look at the Autism at Work programs that are listed up there. I would tell them to go to RespectAbility's website, Disability In, a number of the different disability organizations in the United States, and look at the different programs that are available. And then I tell them to call OFCCP. Because they are part of a protected class that we care deeply about, and we will work with them to try to put them in contact with all of those resources so we can help them as well. That's what I would tell them.
Somebody asked about Oregon and sub-minimum wage. Mark, thank you for bringing that up and talking about how really the movement is shifting and that there's the really that stronger emphasis on competitive integrated employment. We had somebody asking a question about disability disclosure in the workplace. That is a very difficult thing to do, particularly if it's a mental health condition, so that then the stigma is associated with saying I'm bipolar or I have depression. But it's a conversation that more employers are having, especially because more people are developing mental health conditions because of this pandemic. So we had cut off Shane. And any other last pieces of advice, Shane, you have for any current job seekers in terms of getting into the workforce, even nowadays?
Well, I really appreciated Congressman Sherman's comments, and I actually wanted to reframe my response around some of what he was talking about in terms of entrepreneurship. So certainly we don't want to take for granted that entrepreneurship is easy at all. And the number of small businesses that unfortunately don't make it within the first couple of years of opening certainly needs to be taken into consideration. But certainly when we look at opportunities, an individual with a lived experience that is running their own organization, if they're applying that lived experience to the products and services that they're offering, which is potentially a differentiator, right? So if you look at the business case for including persons with disabilities, that extends far beyond companies that just hire inclusively. The market potential for accessible products and services. If a person with a disability is themselves leading that, and helping to address barriers for others with a shared experience and also taking advantage of that market opportunity, that's a pretty exciting proposition.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. So I've gotten a question about neurodiversity in the chat box. And so I want to go Mark, Craig, and then Shane again, if you'd like. And we have a question about, neurodiversity is a very important topic in employment these days. One of our guests mentioned how they work with women on the autism spectrum to develop job skills, but also the importance of offering customized employment. So I'm curious, Craig, Mark, and Shane, kind of how do you see success or best practices around neurodiversity in the workplace?
Yes, that's something that's very close to my heart, and something I care deeply about. I think every federal contractor should have an autism at work program or a neurodiversity at work program. We initially saw them starting in the tech field, the tech sector, with some very prominent ones. I actually visited a couple, one at Microsoft, one at SAP. I visited a program at CVS Health. We've seen that they're expanding into other industries, and really it's something that should be in every industry. And I support them in the tech field, of course, but there sometimes is, you talk about stereotypes and stigmas. There is an idea out there that, people with autism sometimes are savants or something like that in the tech field. And there is, that is true sometimes, but there's still, every person with autism is different, and not all of them are experts in tech, but they deserve a job and they deserve an opportunity. And the way that they look at the world through neurodiversity, like my daughter, let me show you a photo of my daughter, actually, I keep on my desk. This expresses to me neurodiversity. My daughter looks at the world differently than me. We go on hikes, we go on, we love going outdoors, and she just sees things differently than I do. She has profound autism, she's neurodiverse, and she adds value wherever we are because she sees the world a little differently, a different perspective. And that's what neurodiversity is. And it could be someone with profound autism, but it could be moderate or mild. It could be someone that has another intellectual or cognitive disability. It could be neurodiversity generally. But all of that adds to the workforce because that's what you want. That's what diversity is, where you have people that look at things differently, that can solve a problem in a different way. One thing we did see at SAP and Microsoft was they did tell us that a lot of the employees with autism there did do that and added tremendous value and brought in solutions that were incredible. Well, this can be done in every field. Not everyone with autism is going to want to go into tech. Autism is going to be a genius. I mean, we need to also realize that there are certain stereotypes out there, and that they may be very good at other things, and that it's not just certain jobs that are for people with autism. I guess that's the point I want to make, or for people who are neurodiverse. Every company should look at neurodiversity and offer opportunities to people with autism. One other thing I wanted to say, I don't want to belabor it, but it's something I talk a lot about and care a lot about. Look at the way you do your hiring systems. A lot of these autism at work programs focus on the hiring process, and they change it a little bit because some of the things, even though everyone with autism is different, some characteristics that are similar are that often someone with autism might not have eye contact, or it might be a challenge for them, or they may have some social awkwardness. It's difficult for them to speak in that sort of format, but if they're in the workplace, they'll do really well. And so having the interview process be adjusted or opened or accommodated, essentially providing an accommodation through the hiring process to allow, that can let them shine. And then you may be able to employ them. And I want to be clear, that's not special treatment, that's equal treatment. And that's what we're talking about. These accommodations give that person the opportunity to show who they are. And just because they're different, they're neurodiverse, they're not immediately rejected as, oh, you're something other, you're different. That's what we reject. And that's what discrimination is ultimately. And we want to move away from that. And things like, we talk a lot about systemic racism and systemic sexism, and we do that. At OFCCP, we are focused on eliminating that. Discrimination against people with disabilities is the same thing, and it's just as bad. And it needs to be eliminated, and the way you do that is by eliminating stereotypes and giving opportunities for people to be able to apply.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Craig. Now, I'm curious, Mark, from your perspective, how does the vocational rehabilitation system address matters of neurodiversity? Because you have to serve all people of different kinds of disabilities, mobility, physical, cognitive, IDD. So I'm curious, how do you have that conversation in the context of VR and particularly around, say, business outreach work that you do through your agencies?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that outreach occurs for all individuals with disabilities, and and you look at those best matches for individuals based on their skills and abilities. And I think Craig hit on one of the key things is just getting into the door. Those hiring practices are critical in terms of allowing individuals with disabilities, particularly neurodiversity, to be able to have that opportunity. And if you don't interview well, you don't get past that. How do you account for that? And so looking at those strategies for example, you mentioned some of the technology businesses. So Microsoft has a program where the strategy that they employed was, rather than have that 45-minute interview with someone, they bring them in for a week and try them out in different skills and be able to test them out and to really evaluate their fit for the job. And through that process, 110 individuals now have jobs with Microsoft that otherwise wouldn't. Another strategy that I really like is progressive employment, where individuals get into the workplace, and it could be job shadowing, it could be just some career exploration, but it allows the employer to actually interact with the individual and to assess their skills, their interest in the position, and really make a better match for the individual. So I think we have to look at those kinds of strategies that it creates some flexibility and allow for a truer assessment of the individual and the fit into those positions.
I was going to say, I think we have a much deeper conversation to be had in the future about kind of that transition of how do you go from job shadowing to internship to skill building and ultimately into a career pathway. So thank you for bringing that forward, Mark. And I was going to say, Shane, how do you, where do you see neurodiversity in the future, and what issues do you see or in that your own work?
Sure. So kind of a takeoff of both Craig's and Mark's comments. So modern hiring practices inherently are discriminatory in nature, because everyone is trying to screen in the ideal candidate that they have in their mind and immediately trying to screen out anything that is different from that. And so when we approach it that way and we realize that, even taking a look at the technology that we use today to expedite the hiring process, the platforms that we use for matching people between jobs and opportunities, well, the algorithms that we're building to do that, if they are inherently discriminatory based on the biases that are inherent to the person that created them, not purposefully, it's just they don't maybe know otherwise or don't recognize that they're programming that into it. Are we creating more efficient ways to exclude people from the labor force? And people aren't even getting their foot in the door from that standpoint. I think as we talk about neurodiversity, as we talk about the expansion of that conversation, persons with disabilities generally, also the topic of intersectionality. There is so many different ways that people experience barriers to the labor force, barriers to education, barriers to access to benefits and justice and these sorts of things, that we need to recognize that people are unique. People have unique circumstances and experiences. And as disability intersects with other ways that people identify, if we're not paying attention to that, then we're overlooking the cultural context by which people come to these conversations. And there is a crossover between disability and race and gender and age and all of these things. It's important that we keep that in mind when we have any of these conversations about systemic reform and hiring practices, as we incentivize the private sector to take action, as we change technology, those sorts of things.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shane. And I'm really glad you touched on that intersectionality piece, because that's the kind of the last thing I'd like us to, as a panel, I should say a manel, because we lost some of our diversity due to extraneous factors. I do want us to pause and reflect on, each of us in our own ways, as a policy wonk, as a agency leader, as a advocate, what can we all do to really drive diversity and inclusion in both our field, but also in the work that we do. So I'll go Mark, Craig, and Shane.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. So as we look at our state plans, we just went through that review process, and as a part of that, they do a comprehensive statewide needs assessment. We're actually seeing that there is more diversity in the individuals that are coming into the VR programs. They're serving more individuals, I think, from minority backgrounds, and looking particularly as compared to the state population data. So we're seeing some progress there. But I think also just recognizing that we need to do more in terms of bringing in that diversity to our profession. And so as a program, VR is able to provide some grants to some of our minority institutions. So we currently have 7 historically Black colleges and universities and 6 Hispanic serving institutions that are supporting the training of future VR counselors. So we hope to be able to bring that diversity into the field by increasing the number of counselors with minority backgrounds. And then in addition to that, we're supporting one tribal college to provide training to VR counselors that are working in the tribal programs. And CSA VR, I know that the Association for VR Programs is working on the development of an equity statement. And so I'm really excited to see that activity, but also to start seeing the action around that and how they intend to implement that. So our programs are aware, and they are taking steps to address those issues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the work you're doing around HCBUs and Hispanic serving institutions. And thank you for sharing that, Mark. Craig, diversity and intersectionality, what does it mean for OFCCP, and where can we bring it into our work?
OFCCP is very focused on intersectionality. We're doing it in the race and gender context, looking at the intersection of race and gender. And now we're seeking to try to bring in disability status as well, to look at intersectional issues there. And there's also often socioeconomic intersectional issues as well. Let me give you an example from my perspective. I mentioned before that my daughter has profound autism. I have fought for accommodations for her in her IEP for a decade. And I am a lawyer and the head of a federal agency. I don't bring that up, obviously, but I know what I'm talking about in these areas. My wife is a psychiatrist, board certified in child psychiatry and adult psychiatry, and we have a hard time getting accommodations, even though we're basically experts in the field. And it makes me think that, and also I'm very outspoken, as you can see. I fight for it. I fight for my daughter, and a lot of people will fight for their kids or fight for their colleagues or for themselves. But it's often hard because you don't know what to ask for. You don't know what to say. You don't know what the company is able to do. And that sort of ad hoc decentralized process is not a great thing. So what the best thing that federal contractors can do, for example, or your company, is from the top down, you need to make it clear that you are a neurodiverse employer. It should be on your website. It should say, we are a neurodiverse employer. We are committed to full inclusion of people with disabilities in employment. We welcome accommodations. We don't look at it as a legal issue. It is a legal issue, but we welcome, we look at it as a productivity issue. We want to grant you an accommodation. We want you to ask us. You have a message from your CEO, and you do it quarterly to all your staff, welcoming people to request accommodations and welcoming people with disabilities and talking about disabilities in a positive way and not looking at it as a legal issue or, oh, that's legal. Or anytime someone makes a request for an accommodation, put them through a very comprehensive legal process, which basically just causes people not to want to make an accommodation request. And then you grant them as a matter of course, so that it doesn't depend on the person requesting it, being a lawyer or being a doctor or having certain experience and know how to ask something, or continue until you finally grant it. It is that sort of systemic approach from the employer, from the government, from the employer, from institutions that go to the employee and go to the person or the applicant. That's how you address intersectionality. That's how you address full inclusion of people with disabilities. And then, let me tell you, you'll get people to apply. People with disabilities will love to apply. Like you mentioned, many are looking for jobs. They'll apply to your employer. They'll say immediately that they have a disability. You won't have an issue with self-identification. They'll want to self-identify because they know it's going to help them in employment because you're going to accommodate them. And they know that you also have a 7% utilization goal, and they're going to want to help you meet it. So that's my general thinking on that.
Absolutely, Craig. And that's the important thing is, you know, it can't just be a one-off autism program or an IDD program. It needs to be about bringing systemic change across the entire spectrum of disabilities and across the spectrum of different, you know, matters of intersectionality. So, Shane, do you have any final last comments on diversity and intersectionality? And you got to keep it real quick.
I do, yeah. So I'm very excited about the forthcoming publication of a project that we've been working on this topic, which really does a geographic overlay of available demographic information around persons with disabilities in the US and the trends that might be impacting employment, such as technological unemployment due to automation or the impact of the pandemic. And though the index is not intended to be scientifically deterministic, it provides a different level of insight about how people may experience such events and how their intersectional identities around age, disability type, economic situation, education level, gender, geography, those sorts of things, all have a bearing on the outcomes and potential interventions. If we take a step back and actually look at how those trends are converging and how they're impacting human beings, it will improve the policymaking process and the design of interventions from community groups and our ability to even start this conversation in a very real way to engage that community in a way that makes sense, right? To respect the cultural context of individuals and empower them to lead within their own communities by first understanding how they might be identifying in the first place.
Perfect. All right. And I wish we had more time, but we all have very busy things to do. Mark has an ADA DOT event to get to. We've all got to go change the world in our own way. So thank you to my esteemed panelists for joining us. Thank you for your what you brought forward and what you've shared with us.